At 11:06 a.m., 12 men realized the evacuation would not work. The machinery they had relied on for months was failing. Not slowly, not predictably, catastrophically. If they followed procedure, they would still be inside when the structure came down. What they didn't know yet was that the only modification capable of saving them violated every safety protocol they had been trained to follow, and that the man who proposed it had never tested it before. Not in training, not in simulation, not even in theory. He had 8 minutes to make it work. If he failed, no one would know what they had tried. The collapse would erase everything, including them. The year is 1943. Deep in the industrial zones of occupied territory, Allied engineering teams operate behind a fragile line of secrecy and speed. Their job is not glamorous. They dismantle enemy infrastructure. They extract intelligence. They disappear before anyone notices. This particular team has been underground for 17 days. The facility they are working in was never supposed to collapse. German engineers had reinforced it years earlier. It was stable, predictable, safe enough, until it wasn't. The man at the center of this is not a commander, not an officer. He's a field engineer, 26 years old, trained in structural mechanics and improvisation under pressure. His name does not appear in most records, not because he failed, but because what happened next was never supposed to be documented. The mission was simple: extract equipment, avoid detection, leave no trace. But at 10:58 a.m., the first support beam cracked. By 11:02, 3 more followed. By 11:06, the entire western corridor was compromised, and the only exit required a lift system that was no longer responding. The lift was designed to move cargo, not people, and certainly not 12 men in under 10 minutes. It operated on a manual winch system, slow, controlled, safe. Under normal conditions, a full ascent took 19 minutes. They had 8. The structure was collapsing in sections. The sound was constant now, metal bending, concrete fracturing, dust filling the air so thick it burned to breathe. The team leader made the call: abandon heavy equipment, prioritize personnel, get to the surface. But the numbers didn't work. 12 men, 1 lift platform, maximum safe capacity, 4, 3 trips, 19 minutes each, 57 minutes total. The ceiling would come down in less than 15. Someone suggested splitting up, using the secondary shaft. It had collapsed 6 days earlier, unusable. Someone else suggested the ventilation ducts, too narrow, and they led nowhere, just lateral shafts that terminated in sealed compartments. The only way out was up, and the only way up was the lift. But the lift was too slow. Every man in that room understood what that meant. Standard evacuation doctrine was clear: oldest personnel first, injured second, mission critical roles third. But there were no injured, and every role was critical. So the question became something no one wanted to say out loud: who stays behind? The engineer stood near the winch. He wasn't speaking. He was staring at the drum assembly, the cable, the brake mechanism. The team leader was talking, trying to organize, trying to make a decision that wouldn't feel like murder. But the engineer wasn't listening. He was calculating. The winch system had a governor, a safety device designed to prevent the platform from ascending too quickly. If the load moved too fast, the brake engaged automatically. It was there to protect the cable, to protect the passengers, to prevent catastrophic failure. But it was also the reason they were going to die. The governor limited speed, and speed was the only variable that mattered now. He looked at the team leader. We can override it. Silence. Override what? The governor. We remove the brake limiter. Let the drum spin freely. The team leader stared at him. That'll snap the cable. Maybe. Maybe. If the load is too heavy, or if the ascent is too fast. Yes, it could snap. Then what are you suggesting? We reduce the load, 2 men per trip, maximum speed, no braking until the final 3 meters. And if the cable fails, then it fails. Another voice cut in, older, calmer. That's not a plan, that's suicide. The engineer didn't argue. It's the only option that gets anyone out. You don't know that. You don't know what happens when you disable that system. No, I don't. So you're guessing. Yes. The dust was thicker now, the sound of cracking concrete louder. The team leader looked around the room. 12 faces, all waiting. He looked back at the engineer. How long to modify it? 3 minutes? And you're sure it's possible? No. Every manual, every field guide, every safety briefing they had ever attended said the same thing. Never disable structural safety mechanisms under load. Never operate machinery outside rated parameters. Never bypass fail-safes in collapse scenarios. The reasoning was simple. Desperation led to mistakes. Mistakes led to casualties. And casualties in confined spaces led to total loss. Better to follow procedure and accept limited survival than to gamble everything on an untested modification. That was the doctrine. The engineer ignored it. He moved to the winch assembly, pulled a wrench from his pack, started loosening the governor housing. No one stopped him, but no one helped either. The team leader watched, his face unreadable. If this fails, I know. No, I don't think you do. The engineer kept working. If this fails, the cable snaps, the platform drops, and whoever's on it dies on impact. I know. And if it doesn't snap, but the brake fails at the top, they crash into the upper gate. I know. So you understand what you're asking me to authorize? The engineer stopped, looked up. I'm not asking you to authorize anything. I'm telling you it's the only option. That's not the same thing. It is now. The team leader said nothing. The engineer went back to work. The governor assembly was held in place by 4 bolts. He removed 3. The 4th was stripped, corroded, frozen in place. He applied pressure. The wrench slipped. He reset, tried again, slipped again. Someone handed him a smaller tool, a pry bar. He wedged it into the gap, levered it. The bolt sheared. The governor housing came free. Inside was the brake drum, a spring-loaded mechanism designed to engage automatically when rotational speed exceeded safe limits. He disconnected the spring, pulled the brake pads clear, removed the engagement pin. The drum was now free to spin without resistance. He looked at the team leader. It's done. Test it. No time. Then how do you know it works? I don't. The team leader stared at him, and then at the lift, then at the men waiting behind him. He made a decision. First group, 2 men, lightest load. 2 men stepped forward. The engineer moved to the winch, gripped the manual crank. The team leader stopped him. You're not going first. I'm the only one who knows how to control it. Exactly. Which means if it fails, we need you here to fix it. The engineer hesitated. Another man stepped forward. Older, experienced. I'll operate it. The engineer showed him the rhythm, the release point, the manual brake override for the final descent. Don't let it spin too fast, don't brake too early, and don't stop halfway. Understood. The 2 men climbed onto the platform. The operator gripped the crank and began to turn. The crank turned, slowly at first, then faster. The cable tightened. The platform lifted. No resistance, no automatic braking, just momentum. The 2 men on the platform gripped the side rails. They said nothing. Their faces were pale. The drum spun faster than it was ever designed to spin. The operator kept rhythm, steady, controlled. 10 meters, 20. The cable vibrated. A low hum that grew louder as the speed increased. 30 meters. Someone below was counting time. 40 seconds. The platform was halfway to the surface. The operator's hands were shaking now, not from fear, from exertion. The crank was moving fast enough that controlling it required constant pressure. If he let go, the drum would spin freely, the platform would accelerate, and the cable would snap. 40 meters. 1 minute 10. The sound changed, a sharp metallic ping. Everyone froze. The cable had shifted. One of the strands had separated, not broken, but visible, a thin wire spiraling outward from the main braid. The operator kept turning. 50 meters. The platform was almost at the top. 1 minute 40. The engineer watched the drum. The separated strand was unwinding further. If it caught on the housing, it would jam. Or worse. He stepped forward, pulled a rag from his pocket, wrapped it around the loose strand, held it tight against the drum. The friction burned through the cloth in seconds. He didn't let go. 60 meters. The platform reached the upper gate. The operator slammed the manual brake. The drum stopped. The platform swayed, but held. The 2 men climbed off, disappeared into the corridor above. The engineer released the strand. His hand was blistered. The team leader looked at him. Again. The platform descended. Faster now. The operator had learned the rhythm. 2 more men climbed on. The crank turned. The cable hummed. The separated strand was worse now, fraying visibly with each rotation. 20 meters. 30. The sound of collapse below was constant, louder than before. Entire sections of the facility were giving way. 40 meters. The cable shifted again. This time, 2 strands separated. The operator saw it. His hands hesitated. The engineer shouted, "Don't stop!" The operator kept turning. 50 meters. The platform swayed. The cable was vibrating hard enough now that dust was shaking loose from the upper framework. 60 meters. The brake engaged. The 2 men climbed off. 4 men evacuated, 8 remaining. The engineer looked at the cable. It was failing, not catastrophically, but progressively. Each ascent added stress. Each rotation frayed it further. The team leader saw it too. How many more trips? The engineer didn't answer. How many? 2? Maybe 3? Maybe. The cable won't last 4. The team leader looked at the remaining men. Double the load, 4 per trip. The engineer shook his head. That'll snap it for sure. Then we go 3, and someone stays behind? No one spoke. The engineer looked at the cable, at the drum, at the separated strands spiraling outward like unraveling thread. He ran the numbers. 4 men, increased load, increased tension, increased rotational speed to compensate. The cable wouldn't hold. But 3 men, light load, controlled ascent. It might. He looked at the team leader. 3 per trip, 2 trips, 6 men out. That leaves 2. I know. The team leader stared at him. You're staying. It wasn't a question. The engineer nodded. And me. The team leader didn't argue. He turned to the remaining men. Oldest 3 on the platform. Now. 3 men climbed on. None of them looked back. The operator turned the crank. The platform lifted. The cable screamed. Not a hum anymore. A high-pitched metallic whine that cut through the sound of collapsing concrete. 20 meters. 30. The separated strands were unraveling faster now. The outer braid was visibly thinner. 40 meters. The engineer watched the drum, watched the way the cable twisted as it spooled. It was going to fail. Not this trip, but the next one. 50 meters. The whine grew louder. 60 meters. The brake engaged. The platform stopped. The 3 men climbed off. 7 evacuated. 5 remaining. The platform descended. The cable looked worse. Much worse. The outer braid was nearly gone. Only the inner core remained intact. The team leader looked at the 3 men waiting, then at the engineer. Last trip. 3 men. The engineer shook his head. It won't hold 3. You just said I was wrong. Doc, look at it. The team leader looked. The cable was unraveling in real time now, strands peeling away with each slight movement. He looked back at the engineer. Then how many? 2? Maybe? The team leader closed his eyes, opened them, pointed at 2 men. You 2, on the platform. They climbed on. The operator turned the crank. The cable lifted. The whine was deafening now. 10 meters. 15. The inner core was visible, exposed, thin, 20 meters. The engineer stepped closer to the drum, watching, calculating, 30 meters. The cable shifted. A single strand in the core snapped. The platform dropped half a meter. The 2 men on it grabbed the rails. The operator froze. The engineer shouted, "Keep turning!" The operator turned. The platform climbed. Slower now. The remaining strands were taking the full load. 40 meters. Another strand snapped. The platform dropped again. 50 meters. The whine turned into a grinding sound, metal on metal. The cable was seconds from total failure. 60 meters. The brake engaged. The 2 men climbed off. The platform swayed and held. 9 evacuated. 3 remaining. The engineer, the team leader, the operator. The operator looked at the cable, then at the engineer. It's done. That was the last trip. The engineer nodded. I know. The team leader stepped forward. 1 more. You 2. I'll stay. The operator shook his head. No, you're mission critical. You go. It's not a debate. The engineer interrupted. Neither of you are staying. They both looked at him. The cable won't hold 2, but it might hold 1. The team leader stared. You're not serious? Look at it. The cable was barely recognizable. Just a few strands wrapped loosely around the core. The operator spoke quietly. Even if it holds, you can't operate the winch from the platform. The engineer smiled. Not happily, just acknowledgement. I know. He walked to the winch, started disconnecting the manual brake override. The team leader grabbed his arm. What are you doing? Rigging a counterweight system. If I can balance the load, the platform will ascend on its own. That's insane. It's physics. He worked fast, detaching the brake assembly, reversing the tension spring, locking the drum into a free spin configuration. He tested it. The drum rotated, slowly but consistently. He looked at the team leader. Get on the platform. Not without... There's no time. The sound of collapse was immediate now. The western wall was gone. The ceiling directly above them was sagging. The operator climbed onto the platform. The team leader didn't move. The engineer stepped closer. You dying here doesn't save me, it just kills both of us. The team leader looked at him, then climbed on. The engineer released the counterweight. The platform lifted, slowly, unstably, but lifting. 10 meters. The cable groaned. 20 meters. The engineer watched from below. 30 meters. The cable twisted. 1 strand separated. 40 meters. The platform was shaking now, swaying in wide arcs. 50 meters. Another strand snapped. The platform dropped, caught, climbed again. 60 meters. The brake didn't engage. There was no brake. The platform crashed into the upper gate. Both men were thrown forward, but alive. They scrambled off, looked down. The engineer was still below, standing in the center of the room, watching the ceiling. The team leader shouted, "We're coming back!" The engineer shook his head. "No cable?" It was true. The cable had snapped the moment the platform hit the gate. The team leader stared. The engineer looked up at him and nodded, then turned and walked toward the secondary shaft, the one they had said was collapsed. The secondary shaft had collapsed 6 days earlier. That was true, but only the upper section. The engineer had surveyed it on day 4. Alone? While the rest of the team worked the primary site. He hadn't told anyone because there was nothing to tell. The shaft was blocked. Unusable for evacuation, but not entirely sealed. The collapse had created a gap, narrow, unstable, but passable. It didn't lead to the surface. It led to a lateral maintenance tunnel, one that ran parallel to the main facility. It had been used during initial construction, then abandoned. The Germans had sealed it, but not thoroughly. The engineer had found the access point 3 days ago. He had mapped it, checked the integrity, calculated the risk, and decided it wasn't worth mentioning, because it was a one-person route. An evacuation protocol required group movement, but now protocol didn't matter. He reached the secondary shaft, climbed over the rubble, squeezed through the gap. The tunnel beyond was dark, low, barely shoulder width. He moved forward. The air was thicker here, dust mixed with something chemical, old explosives maybe, or fuel residue. He kept moving. The ceiling groaned. Sections of it had already fallen. He climbed over them. 50 meters, 100. The tunnel curved, descended slightly, then leveled out. Ahead, faint light, not daylight, something artificial. He moved toward it. The tunnel opened into a storage chamber, small, reinforced, and empty, except for a ventilation grate in the ceiling. He looked up. The grate led to a surface duct, narrow, vertical, but climbable. He pulled a tool from his pack, pried the grate loose, climbed. The duct was tight. His shoulders scraped the sides. He climbed. 10 meters, 20. The duct opened into a surface-level exhaust port, camouflaged, overgrown with vegetation. He pushed through and emerged. The team was waiting 200 meters away. At the primary extraction point, they saw him. No one spoke. The team leader walked over, looked at him. "How?" The engineer didn't answer. By the time they returned to the rally point, the facility had collapsed entirely. No one went back to confirm. The mission was classified as a partial loss. Equipment abandoned. Timeline exceeded. But 12 men extracted. 0 casualties. The engineer's modification was never officially documented. The field report listed standard evacuation procedures. No mention of the disabled governor. No mention of the cable failure. No mention of the secondary route. Because none of it should have worked. And when something works that shouldn't, the safest option is silence. After the war, the engineer returned to civilian life. He never spoke about the modification, not to colleagues, not to family, not because it was heroic, but because survival in collapse scenarios often required doing the one thing doctrine explicitly forbade. And no one wanted to hear that the rules they trusted could be wrong. This account is based on documented wartime engineering incidents and declassified after-action reports. Names and identifying details have been altered, but the decisions, and their consequences, are real.